So we are ready to get fully into the 1950s. Early 50s really dominated by the Cold War, dominated by McCarthyism, and a lot of that worry and suspicion is going to continue for the rest of the decade, but a whole bunch of other stuff happened. At the end of World War II was followed by at least one scholar has called the golden age of capitalism. It's a period of huge and actually pretty steady economic expansion, relatively stable prices, fairly low unemployment, rising standard of living, and that will continue into the early 1970s. Between the end of the war, between about 1946 and 1960, the American gross national product more than doubled. And a lot of the benefit flowed to the people who were actually making the products, not just to the people who owned the company, but regular workers benefited tremendously from this growth, which is, in our history, that's actually kind of unusual, right? In basically every way that you can measure, in terms of better diets, better housing, better education, better access to recreation, most Americans lived better than their parents had. By 1960, about 60% of Americans enjoyed the standard middle class standard of living. You're not living paycheck to paycheck. You're able to save some up. You're able to send a kid to college. You're able to have the week-long family vacation in the wood-sided station wagon. That middle class standard. The official poverty rate at the start of the decade in 1950 was 30%. That's close to 1 in 3 Americans. By the end of the decade, it's going to be down to 22%. Although we do need to recognize that 22% is still more than 1 in every 5 Americans. A whole bunch of technological changes happened. A lot of innovations came into very widespread use that transformed the daily lives of regular people. Things like television became very widespread. Air conditioning, the window units, air conditioning, super important for this part of the country. Dishwashers and jets and indoor plumbing. My mother can remember when their house out in western Oklahoma got indoor plumbing for the first time. Electricity, central heating. Things that, within living memory for people, had only been available to the rich. Now average homes can have them. The United States was still the world's dominant industrial power. Even though Europe was starting to recover, Japan was recovering tremendously, in terms of industry, the United States was still dominant. Major industries like steel and cars and aircraft, American companies dominated the world market. Now, the Cold War, just like any other war, fueled a lot of industrial production. The West Coast benefited enormously from government contracts for aircraft and guided missiles and radar systems. The South, continuing that trend that started during the war, the South became the home to a bunch of military bases, government shipyards. New England, those northern states, they recovered from a big industrial slump by building aircraft engines and submarines. But in retrospect, looking back at it, the 1950s kind of looks like the last decade of the industrial age in the United States. Since that point, the American economy has shifted rapidly towards service and education and finance and information, while our manufacturing base has declined considerably. Even during the 1950s, we started to see that happening. The number of factory workers began to fall. Not a whole lot, but it did start to fall, while clerical workers grew by about 25%. Salaried employees, middle management, accountants rose by about 60%. The unions had succeeded in getting better wages and safer conditions and good benefits packages, but that also inspired bosses to mechanize more, trying to reduce labor. By 1956, for the first time, white-collar professionals outnumbered blue-collar manual laborers. The long-term trend toward farm concentration also continued. During the 1950s, agricultural production rose by about 50%, but the farm population fell by 8 million people. Now, the reason production continued to grow despite the loss of 8 million people was better machinery, chemical fertilizers, mass-produced chemical insecticides, better irrigation. That opened up a lot more land to commercial farming. We started to see, commercially produced, genetically modified crop strains. During the 1950s, the changes in the South that had started during the New Deal, they began to speed up. New tractors, and harvesting machines, and finding less labor-intensive crops like soybeans instead of cotton reduced the need for farm workers. The loss of 8 million farm workers, 3 million of those came from the southern states. Now, the center of American farming moved to the Southwest, Texas, Arizona, and especially California. Now, the big corporate farms out there, especially the ones in California, just created an endless supply of fruits and vegetables. In the 1920s, orange juice used to be a luxury. It was something that you could only get in season, or it was only for the wealthy. But during the 1950s, it became an essential part of your complete breakfast. The main sort of engine of the economic growth was residential construction and spending on consumer products. Just like Fordism said, right? If you're going to create consumer products, then you need to have people who can buy consumer products. And we got really good at that during this decade. We had that baby boom, that post-war baby boom. People started leaving the cities, moving into the suburbs. So that created an enormous demand for new construction and for everything that you put in those houses. During the 1950s, the number of houses in the United States doubled. Nearly all of them built in suburbs like these. Like this is the original Long Island Levittown. William and Alfred Levitt were probably the most famous new suburban developers. They built the first Levittown on 1,200 acres of potato fields on Long Island right after the end of the war. They put up about 10,000 houses, assembled very quickly, mostly from prefab parts, and they priced those houses well within the reach of average American workers. They were specifically targeting returning veterans who were getting mortgages under the GI Bill. So the down payment for one of these little houses was only $100. That first Levittown, with its 10,000 houses, was soon home to more than 40,000 people. But it was California that really became the most prominent symbol of this growth of suburbia. 20% of the population growth in the 1950s happened in California alone. In 1963, it passed New York. It was the nation's most populated state. Now, most Western growth, despite the shift of farming, most growth in the Western states happened in metro areas, in the suburbs around metro areas. The suburban growth spilled into older farming regions, like the San Fernando Valley and the San Bernardino Valley. About a third of California's land area, not including the mountains or the deserts, was paved over with roads and parking lots. Life began to center around the car. People drove to and from work. They did their shopping at malls that you could only get to by driving. In other parts of the country as well, it's not just a California problem. In other parts of the country, shopping shifted from Main Street to suburban malls, to shopping centers, to business strips with the franchises. And you can see that in this area. You drive down Joplin. There's been, that I can remember, at least 3 downtown revitalization campaigns to get people to shop on Main Street in Joplin. And you can drive down it today and see how many windows are still boarded up. Most people go to Rangeline. Another change brought about by the suburbs was the growth of lawns. Today, more land is cultivated in grass than in any agricultural crop in the United States. Now, the roots of the consumer culture of the 1950s go way, way back. Goes back to the Gilded Age easily. But we had never seen affluence, consumerism, the ability to buy stuff be so widespread. And in a consumer culture like this, part of people's definition of freedom is their ability to have that standard of living, to keep up with the Joneses, to buy things. In a sense, the 50s kind of represented the culmination of that long-term trend, where Americans became less important as citizens, less important as political participants, and more important as consumers. We talked about that. We talked about the Gilded Age. We talked about it worsening during the 1920s. And the 50s, things really start to get out of control. People pay much more attention to keeping up with the Joneses, buying on credit instead of saving up. Americans became very comfortable living with debt as long as they could purchase. And people knew exactly what they were supposed to purchase by flipping on the TV. The image of a good middle-class life and advertisements for everything that you need to live that life just blanketed the country. By the end of the 50s, nearly 9 out of 10 American families owned at least one TV set. TV began to replace newspapers as the most common source of information, and TV watching became the #1 leisure activity in the country. In 1950, the average American spent 4.5 hours a day watching television. By 1970, it was almost 6 hours a day. The TV changed our eating habits, certainly. Frozen TV dinners first went on sale in 1954. And it also TV provided Americans from lots of different backgrounds, from all different regions, with a common cultural experience. There was the water cooler show, right? You go to work on Monday morning and you can talk with your buddy around the water cooler about what shows you watched over the weekend or what you watched last night. And it was real easy to do that because nobody had the 5,000 channel cable packages back then. They had the 3-channel rabbit ear packages back then. Literally, that's how many channels there were. There was ABC, NBC, CBS, and that's it. With a few exceptions, television tended to avoid controversy, tried to project this image of a middle-class life. By the end of the decade, some shows that had been different at the beginning, like The Honeymooners, was an early 1950s TV show. It actually only ran for about a year. And by the end of the decade, shows like that had been replaced with the quiz shows, with westerns, with suburban comedies like Leave It to Beaver and The Donna Reed Show. Television also became just the most effective advertising medium ever. Large corporations trying to, polish up their image, they sponsored programs like the General Electric Theater. That was a show hosted by Ronald Reagan when he was still an actor. They sponsored soap operas. Well, they'd been doing that since the soap operas were on radio. And when they made the jump to TV, the advertisers followed. Now, they're called soap operas because in the beginning they were sponsored by Procter & Gamble or Palmolive, things like that, things that housewives will buy. TV ads showed people what a good life looked like, as long as it was based on endless consumption. Along with the house and the TV set, the car became part of the standard consumer package in the 1950s. By the end of the decade, 80% of American families had at least one. 14% had 2 or more, almost all of them made in the United States. And they were good cars, right? I mean, cars from the 1950s, 40s, 30s, and even 20s are still on the road, because they were made not to break down. But they were designed to go out of style in a year or two, because you didn't want people to buy them, which is why it's so much easier to tell 1953 from 1954 than it is a 2003 from a 2004. During the 1950s, the auto industry with its demand for all sorts of things, more steel, more rubber, more products, more roads. That built a lot of industries back up. The automobile was kind of like the pivot that suburban life turned on. It transformed our daily lives. It changed our landscape. We start getting motels and drive-in theaters and roadside fast food restaurants. The first McDonald's opened in 1954. Within 10 years, there were 700 across the country. And the car also affected our ideas of freedom. Freedom meant mobility. It meant choice. It meant being able to go elsewhere in your pursuit of happiness. But when the suburbs became so important, just the center of the American way of life, it put a lot of pressure on the family, and especially on moms, to live up to the standard. After 1945, women lost most of the good-paying, unionized industrial jobs that they'd had during the war. But they continued to work. During the 1950s, most women who worked outside the home were concentrated in the low-paying, unskilled jobs. But the number of working women rose, especially in part-time jobs. Part of it is women had gotten a taste of earning their own paycheck and they want it back. And part of it is sometimes a single paycheck is not enough to keep up the standard of living, especially for a working class family. You want the house, you want the new car every 3 or 4 years, you want the family vacations. And of course, we can't forget that poor women have always worked outside the home by necessity. By 1955, there were actually more women working outside the home than there had been during World War II. Despite that, though, the assumption was still that the family breadwinner would be male and that the wife would stay at home. Entertainment showed marriage as the most important goal of American women. And during the 1950s, lots of young people agreed. Lots of young men and women. They married quite a bit younger in the 1950s than they had in the 40s or the 30s. Women married at an average age of 20 and men at 22. The baby boom lasted into the mid-60s. The population of the United States rose by about 30 million people just during the 1950s. And we were not getting a whole lot of immigration. That increase is due mostly to a huge number of births. But some of it also rests on the fact that the American life expectancy was getting considerably longer, thanks to better health, better food, and better medicine. Things like penicillin and the polio vaccine were huge. The American family was also used as a weapon in the Cold War. One American government official said that one of the things that separates the United States from the communist world is that our women can stay at home. That proves that we're more free. Of course, the Soviets said, our women can go out and work wherever they want to. That proves that we are more free. Both sides are using the family and using the status of women to prove their freedom. They're just emphasizing different things. Now, the family life that was so important in the 50s was not the same as it was in the late 1800s or even the early 1900s. This was supposed to be a modernized relationship. Both partners were supposed to have some personal fulfillment. It's just that a woman's personal fulfillment was supposed to come from having the newest vacuum and the softest toilet paper. Like other forms of criticism and dissent, organized feminism faded into the background during the 1950s. Women who wanted more than this were considered to have mental disorders. They were hysterical. Hysteria was a very common diagnosis for all sorts of ailments and attitude problems that women had had ever since the early 1800s. And that diagnosis was still being handed out in the 1950s. Psychologists believed that if a woman was unhappy with her Barbie dream home, that stems from her failure to accept her natural instinct. One of them wrote that the independent woman is a contradiction in terms. And the idea of domestic life as a refuge and full-time motherhood as the woman's sphere had a several decades long history in the United States. Not as long as you might think, though. It really grew out of the 1820s, 1830s. But it's more than 100 years old at this point. But in the post-war suburbs, family life was physically separated from the outside world, from work, from extended family, from social organizations. And for some of these women, the nuclear family and the Barbie dream house was all that they had. Now the suburbs became this new site to enjoy American freedom. But the suburbs also kept one very familiar characteristic. They tended to have very rigid racial boundaries. Even today, more than 80% of suburban whites live in communities with a non-white population of less than 1%. And that's the legacy of decisions made by governments, banks, and real estate developers going all the way back to the New Deal. During the suburban boom after the war, federal agencies continued to ensure mortgages that would not let you resell your property to a person of a different race. So they were effectively supporting segregated housing. Now in 1948, the Supreme Court said that those provisions were legally unenforceable. That's the first time they said that. But banks and private developers continued to borrow minorities from the suburbs. The government refused to subsidize their mortgages except in segregated neighborhoods. In 1960, African Americans made up less than 3% of Chicago's suburbs. The Levitt towns would not sell to black Americans at all, including veterans, and they were built to be bought by veterans. After a lawsuit during the 1960s, the Levitts finally agreed to sell homes to racial minorities, but at a snail's pace. In 1990, the original Long Island Levitt town had 53,000 residents. 127 of them were African American. Now in 1949, Congress passed a Housing Act, and that allowed the government to build more than 800,000 units of public housing to provide a decent home for every family. But the law set a very, very low ceiling on income, which meant that these new housing projects were limited only to the very poor. Now, suburban neighborhoods and white urban neighborhoods protested building any of that public housing in their neighborhoods. So they were confined, these projects were confined to segregated neighborhoods in the inner cities. At the same time, a lot of the old neighborhoods that had been there were being destroyed under urban renewal programs. Cities would demolish poor neighborhoods that occupied potentially valuable real estate. And in the place of these neighborhoods that had been there for decades, developers built shopping centers and all-white middle-class housing and public universities, like Wayne State in Detroit, the University of Illinois at Chicago. They were built on what used to be folks' houses. Now, if you were a white person and you lived in one of these neighborhoods that was being renewed, you could move to the suburbs. But if you weren't, then you couldn't. You were not welcome in the suburbs. Your option was to move into the housing projects, places like Cabrini Green in Chicago, one of the most infamous, or into other rundown city neighborhoods that urban renewal hadn't gotten to yet. And that really damaged people's sense of community that had built up in the old neighborhoods. You know, you used to live on a block where your parents had lived. Maybe your grandparents lived there. You know everybody around you. There's local schools. There's local stores. There's a park for the kids. Then you have to move into this housing project that sticks out like a sore concrete thumb down the hall from people you don't know and don't really trust, and your kids don't have anywhere to play, and the corner store is gone, and you've got to take 3 different train lines for half an hour just to buy groceries, and things really start going downhill for you. Now, suburbanization really hardened the lines of racial division in American life. Between 1950 and 1970, about 7 million white Americans left the central cities for these suburbs that would not sell to non-whites. Racial exclusion became self-reinforcing. Non-whites remained concentrated in mostly unskilled, crappy-paying jobs as a result of employment discrimination because they had very little access to higher education. And as white populations moved out of the cities, so did the industrial jobs. Poor African Americans and Latinos remained trapped in these neighborhoods where they got poorer and even less able to leave. For folks living in the suburbs, their homes weren't just a roof over their heads. Their homes were the family's major financial investment, so they were very fearful that any non-white presence would lower their property values. And that fear was reinforced by real estate companies, by real estate developers in particular. If they want to buy up property cheap, usually to sell, to build a shopping mall or a college, they would circulate rumors that a Latino family or an African American family bought a house in the neighborhood. And then the white residents would try to sell real quick before their property values dropped. And even though the Supreme Court said things like restrictive covenants were legally unenforceable, we saw much less regulation of industry during the 1950s. A lot of industries, including banks, were kind of given not entirely a free hand, but certainly much more of one than they'd had in the 40s. Economic freedom during the Cold War focused a lot on consumer capitalism, on free enterprise. It became more important than political democracy, more important than freedom of speech. This economic system based on free enterprise, private ownership, defined what we considered to be the free world. President Truman said this. A week before he gave his Truman Doctrine speech, President Truman gave another speech talking about essential American freedoms. And he took FDR's 4 freedoms: freedom of speech and worship, freedom from want, freedom from fear, and he cut it down to 3 freedoms instead: freedom of speech and worship, and freedom of enterprise, which Truman said was part and parcel of the American way of life, even more than during the war. Polishing up the image of big business, making people supportive of free enterprise became hugely important. It involved advertising, certainly, also school programs and newspaper editorials and civic activities. But despite all of the talk about the glories of free enterprise and the glories of the free market, government policy played a really crucial role in the economic boom. The expansion of the middle class didn't owe so much to free enterprise or to corporations, owed a lot to federal tax subsidies, mortgage guarantees, the GI Bill, highway construction. All of those are government programs. And free enterprise, to some people, seemed like kind of an odd way of describing an economy where a handful of large corporations dominated. Until well into the 20th century, most ordinary Americans had been really suspicious of big business. They associated the corporations with men like Rockefeller, who manipulated politics and stifled competition and treated his workers badly. But in the 50s, economists began to argue that Americans should stop being so fearful of economic concentration. They said that large-scale production is necessary to fight the commies, And also, large-scale production creates all of those consumer goods that y'all love so much. By the end of the 1950s, public opinion surveys showed that more than 80% of Americans believed that their freedom, their personal freedom, depended on the free enterprise system. And to an extent, both parties agreed with that. Now, Dwight Eisenhower, Ike, he ended World War II as the military leader with the most potential political appeal. Partly because he had this image of kind of like somebody's grandpa, this very warm sort of image, the kind of image that folks like MacArthur did not have. After the war, Eisenhower had held a lot of jobs. He had been Supreme Commander of NATO forces in Europe. He had been the president of Columbia University. And in 1952, he was approached to run for president. He was approached by both major parties. Eisenhower's pretty much straight down the middle in terms of his political beliefs. But he was so popular that everybody knew whichever party he chose is going to be the party that wins. Now, Eisenhower chose to run as a Republican. As his running mate, Eisenhower chose Richard Nixon of California. Nixon's a World War II vet, just like Eisenhower. He had made his name by vigorously chasing after suspected communists. He's one of the guys that went after Alger Hiss. Nixon's tactics gave him a lifelong reputation for being kind of a dishonest opportunist, kind of a jerk. But Nixon was a very shrewd politician. And in fact, it's Nixon that really did the most to repair the image of the Republican Party in the 1950s. During the 20s and 30s and 40s, Republicans had been seen as defenders of big business who don't give a crap about the common man. Nixon, on the other hand, wanted Republicans to reach out to what he called the forgotten man. You know, a hard-working citizen who's overburdened by taxes, who wants his government to be responsive to him. Nixon was extremely good at using very populist language, kind of building on the tactics that Roosevelt and Truman had used, just using it for a different party. Almost as soon as he was named the vice presidential nominee, though, Nixon got into trouble. The press reported that some wealthy donors had created a private fund for his personal use, which is not okay. You're supposed to use campaign donations for your campaign, not for yourself. Eisenhower considered dropping Nixon. But Nixon, good politician, decides to make use of this wonderful new technology. He goes on television, gave this really emotional speech. He denied most of the accusations. I am not a crook. He did admit to receiving one personal gift, and you can see him holding that gift, this little Cocker Spaniel puppy named Checkers. And Nixon said that his daughters had fallen in love with Checkers, and no matter what people say about him, he's not going to give Checkers back. That stupid Checkers speech saved his career. People watched Nixon. Oh, what a good dad. What a nice guy. He's clearly not a crook. He said he wasn't. And this showed how television was starting to change politics by letting candidates bring a very carefully controlled, carefully crafted image directly into voters' living rooms. And the 1952 campaign was the first one to make extensive use of TV ads. The most important factor in the election, though, was Eisenhower's personal popularity. He got 55% of the popular vote. His personal popularity, though, did not extend to the rest of the Republican Party. They barely got a majority in Congress. And in fact, 4 years later, in the 56th election, Democrats will come back to power in Congress. Eisenhower will be reelected, and he'll become the first president ever to win re-election without his party controlling either House of Congress. With the Republicans serving as president for the first time in 20 years, the tone in Washington changed. Wealthy businessmen dominated Eisenhower's government. He made Charlie Wilson, the former president of General Motors, defense secretary. Wilson's the guy who said, "What's good for General Motors is good for the USA." Ike was a fiscal conservative. He supported the business community. He did try to scale back government spending. He even cut the military budget. But when more conservative Republicans told him that he should get rid of Social Security, get rid of the Wagner Act, basically dismantle the New Deal, Eisenhower refused to do it. He said that would be politically disastrous. If any political party attempts to abolish Social Security, unemployment insurance, and eliminate labor laws, he said, you will never hear from that party again. Eisenhower called his program modern republicanism. He didn't want people to think about Republicans and picture Calvin Coolidge and Harding and guys like that anymore. So he kept the core New Deal programs. And in fact, he expanded some of them. Like in 1955, millions of agricultural workers became eligible for Social Security pensions and unemployment for the first time. And Ike did not reduce the scope of the federal government. Despite all of the talk about free enterprise, Eisenhower, he embraced what we call a mixed economy, where the government does play a major role in economic planning and in kind of smoothing out the bumps. We used government spending to promote productivity, to boost employment. Eisenhower presided over the single largest public works project in U.S. history, building the 14,000-mile interstate highway system. The Eisenhower administration also strongly supported the National Defense Education Act, which offered, for the first time, direct federal funding to higher education. And he did that because of the space race. In 1957, the Soviets launched the first artificial satellite, Sputnik. They beat us into space, guys. Eisenhower's not allowing this. So he strongly encourages direct federal money going into higher education. All in all, rather than getting rid of the New Deal, Eisenhower kind of legitimized it. He accepted its basic premises. So he ensured that it would continue no matter what party was in office, at least within his lifetime. The 1950s also saw the labor conflict start to ease up, although it did so less by satisfying labor and more by scaring the pants off them. In 1955, the AFL, the American Federation of Labor, and the Congress of Industrial Organizations merged together. They formed a single organization, the AFL-CIO, represented about 35% of all industrial workers. In major industries, workers and management hammered out what some people call a new social contract. Unions signed long-term agreements that left a lot of decisions up to management, and they also agreed to try to prevent any kind of unauthorized wildcat strike. Employers promised that they would stop trying to prevent unionization and that they would put in place a system where people could get raises and get seniority and get pensions, etc., etc. So unionized workers shared pretty much fully in the prosperity of the 50s, but that new social contract didn't apply to the majority of workers who were not unionized. Employers in industries that weren't already unionized continued to fight bitterly against any attempt by their workers to organize. Some companies picked up and moved south, where the unions were a lot weaker. Then they began to move overseas. By the end of the 50s, the social contract was weakening. Like in 1959, the steel industry tried to limit wage increases in violation of an agreement that they had signed with their workers' union. 500,000 steel workers went on strike. Eisenhower's also got to deal with foreign issues, right? We're in the early Cold War. It's pretty nasty. Soon after he took office, Eisenhower approved an armistice that ended U.S. fighting in Korea. But that didn't actually ease up much tension. Ike took office at a time when the Cold War was entering a really dangerous period. In 1952, the United States tested our first hydrogen bomb. The H-bomb is much more powerful than the one that had been used at Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And then the next year, 1953, the Soviets tested their first H-bomb. And both sides just kind of feverishly tried to develop new weapons and new bombers and find ways to develop to deliver our weapons of mass destruction further away. In 1954, Eisenhower's Secretary of State announced an update to the containment doctrine. We will still try to stop the spread of communism, but we will also respond to any Soviet attack on an American ally by conducting a nuclear attack on the Soviet Union itself. This was known as massive retaliation. Now, in some ways, this reliance on nuclear weapons, on the threat of nuclear war, was a way for Eisenhower to cut military spending. You don't need as many tanks, you don't need as many trucks or as many troops. Now, during his presidency, the size of the armed forces fell by nearly half. But you do need a lot of nuclear warheads, and those rose from 1,000 when he took office to more than 18,000 in 1960. A massive retaliation ran the risk that any small conflict, even a miscommunication, could escalate into a war that would destroy both the Soviets and the United States. Because if we nuke them, you know they're going to nuke us. Eisenhower's critics called it brinksmanship. They said that the president was willing to bring the world to the brink of nuclear war, basically in a dick measuring contest. Now, the reality that all-out nuclear war would result in mutual assured destruction, as they called it, did make both us and the Soviets a lot more cautious in how we dealt with each other. We tiptoed a lot. But it also inspired widespread fear that nuclear war could happen at any second. Government programs encouraged Americans to build bomb shelters like this one in their backyards. And if you can't do that, then probably your town has a public bomb shelter. I know the little town I grew up in had a leftover nuclear fallout shelter from the 1950s, even though the town I grew up in had fewer than 500 people, and I'm sure it was not a Soviet target. School drills trained children to duck and cover. Hide under a desk in the event of a nuclear attack, because that's going to save you. In places like Cleveland, they experimented with giving children dog tags. They're pretty sure that the Soviets are going to attack. This is not really an if they attack, this is a when they attack plan. And so there were different ideas that people experimented with of how to identify the remains, basically, after an attack. And some places, like Detroit and Chicago and Cleveland, discussed, well, we'll tattoo the kids. We'll give them an ID number, and we'll tattoo the ID number onto their arms. That idea didn't fly too well, partly because that's what the Nazis had done, and secondly, because if a nuclear bomb is dropped on Cleveland, there will be no skin left to read the number off of. So in Cleveland, they started giving the kids dog tags with their names and their ID numbers and their contact information, so parents could identify their children when the Soviets attack. That atmosphere of fear that had built during McCarthyism grows to an unbelievable level. And many Americans were convinced that a nuclear war is going to happen, and it's going to happen soon. Now, when Eisenhower first took office, he repeated that very familiar Cold War formula: freedom against slavery, light against dark, good against evil. But the end of the Korean War and then the death of Stalin, which both happened in 1953, made Eisenhower think that maybe we can try something new with the Soviets. Maybe we can reduce this tension. In 1955, Ike met the new leader of the Soviet Union, Nikita Khrushchev, in Geneva, Switzerland. Not entirely certain what all was said there, still classified, but we do know that when Khrushchev left Switzerland, he went back to Moscow, and he gave a speech in front of the Communist Party Congress, basically their big party convention in Moscow, that admitted the crimes that Stalin had committed. Things that most people didn't even know had happened, which really caused kind of a crisis for American communists. They'd been going this whole time believing what Stalin's government had told them and having no idea that Stalin had, purged his political opponents, numbering in the literal millions of people. Had no idea he was doing that. So in the United States, at least 3/4 of the remaining Communist Party members just abandoned the party. They realized that they had been blind to the nature of Stalin's government, and they don't want any part of it anymore. When Khrushchev did this, when he admitted what had happened, and when he repudiated what had happened, we will never do this again, it created the idea that maybe the Soviets could be dealt with. Khrushchev called for a peaceful coexistence with the West, which raised the possibility that the Cold War might ease up a little bit. Of course, that thaw was abruptly shaken the following year, 2 years later. Hungary, the nation of Hungary, Stalin had forced a communist government on them. They had a revolution. They wanted to no longer be communist. Many conservative Americans had supported that. They had urged citizens of Eastern European countries to rise up and resist communist rule. But when push came to shove, Roosevelt would not send aid to the Hungarian Revolution. He believed that it was impossible to roll back Soviet control of Eastern Europe. In 1958, both us and the Soviets agreed to voluntarily stop testing new nuclear weapons. We had a nuclear test ban treaty. That lasted for 2.5 years. In 1959, Khrushchev came to the United States. He toured the U.S. He had a fairly friendly visit with Eisenhower at Camp David. But the spirit of cooperation ended very abruptly in 1960 when the Soviets shot down an American U-2 spy plane that was taking pictures of Soviet nuclear sites. Now, at first, Eisenhower denied that the plane had been involved in espionage, and he refused to apologize even after the Russians produced the pilot who had survived and been captured. And that little incident basically torpedoed any other plans for new meetings. So Europe started to settle into what looked like probably a permanent division between the Communist East and the Capitalist West. But the rivalry continued in the emerging nations, what we call the Third World. The end of World War II saw the old European empires, even the ones on the winning side, start to crumble. Decolonization began when India and Pakistan, after quite a lot of protest and demonstration and work, finally achieved their independence in 1947. Colonies in the rest of Asia, in Africa as well, began to emerge as independent nations. Ghana was the first in Africa. They used to be Britain's Gold Coast colony. They became the nation of Ghana. Other nations like Indonesia and Malaysia, Nigeria, and Kenya followed afterwards. But this presented the United States with a complex set of choices. Decolonization created power vacuums in these places. When Ghana was a British colony, we knew what side Ghana was on because they were British. They're on our side. When Indonesia was a colony, we knew what side they would be on. But when they're not colonies anymore, when the old Western European powers are not there controlling them, we don't know whose side they're going to be on. We don't know where they're going to jump. And we were afraid that communists would try and exploit that. The Soviet Union had given a lot of support to many of these independence movements. They had participated in this. They had strongly supported the end of the old empires. And a lot of non-communist leaders, like Nehru in India and Nkrumah in Ghana, saw socialism as a way to get economic independence and social equality in their country. They weren't necessarily communists themselves, though. Most of these third world countries really did not want to get involved. They didn't want to get dragged into this fight between superpowers. They really wanted to just stay neutral. And many of them admired the United States as much as they admired the Soviets. We were a colony that had gained independence from our imperial power. They saw that as a model to follow. Ho Chi Minh, he was the communist leader of the Vietnamese independence movement. He modeled his 1945 Proclamation of Nationhood after the American Declaration of Independence. He even reached out to President Truman. He asked Truman to send advisors to establish what he called a protectorate over Vietnam to help them get their independence from France and set up a new government framework. Of course, Truman wouldn't do it because Ho Chi Minh was communist. The Cold War was the #1 determining factor in how the United States dealt with every other nation. Containment, stopping the spread of communism, hardened into the U.S. government opposing anybody that seemed to threaten American economic interests, even if those people were not actually communists themselves. And this played out in a couple of really nasty ways, particularly in Guatemala and Iran. Arbenz Guzman in Guatemala and Mohammad Mossadegh in Iran were not communists. They were not agents of Moscow. They were democratically elected, homegrown nationalists, patriots of their nations. But they were both determined that foreign corporations should not control their country's economies. And that meant that, by definition, they were not particularly friendly toward Western business meddling in their nations. When Guzman was elected in Guatemala, his reforms threatened the United Fruit Company. When Mossadegh was elected in Iran, he nationalized the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company, which up to then had been Britain's biggest remaining overseas asset. Their political opponents, both in their countries and in the United States, said, oh my God, they're commies. And they weren't actually communists. But in 1953 and in 1954, the CIA organized military coups in Guatemala and basically just the ouster of the Mossadegh government in Iran. It's a clear violation of the United Nations Charter, and in the long term, not great decisions. It ended up causing a really tremendous amount of trouble, especially in Iran. Mossadegh had been a nationalist. He was a modernist. He was a secularist. He was in favor of democracy. He was, to be honest, he was generally pretty pro-American. Iran, under his government, was moving toward becoming kind of like Turkey is, a secular, democratic, mostly secular, democratic government. The CIA, when they got rid of Mossadegh, brought back the Shah of Iran, kind of like a king. The Shah had been forced to abdicate the throne as the nation became more democratic. Now, the Shah was friendly to the United States, more economically friendly than Mossadegh had been. He supported American economic interests. He agreed to give U.S. and British oil companies 40% of Iran's oil revenue. But the Shah was absolutely brutal. toward his political opponents. And one of those opponents was the Ayatollah Khomeini. Now, that led directly to the Iranian Revolution in 1979 and the establishment of the Islamic Republic of Iran. Not Iran a democracy, but the Iran that we have now. I mean, in 1954, it looked like a good idea at the time. We're stopping the spread of communism, we think. But it helped to create a situation that we're in now with Iran, not to mention the lives of the people living in Iran. The people who died just a few years ago protesting an unfree election. Now, the decisions made half a century ago are affecting people right now. In 1956, Israel, France, and Britain, without consulting the United States, because they didn't think they should have to, invaded Egypt after the new Egyptian leader, Gamal Abdel Nasser, nationalized the Suez Canal. The Suez Canal had been jointly owned by Britain and France, and the Egyptian people were not getting any benefit from having it sliced through their country. So they invaded after Nasser tried to take it over. Eisenhower was furious, and he forced them to abandon that invasion. But the Suez fiasco proved that the United States, for the first time, could dominate Britain, and the U.S. became the major foreign power in the Middle East. American companies increasingly dominated the oil fields. Ike issued the Eisenhower Doctrine, which said the United States will defend Middle Eastern governments against communism or nationalism. In 1945, when the Japanese were expelled from Vietnam at the end of the war, it did not lead to Vietnamese independence, as Ho Chi Minh had wanted. Instead, France went freaking insane, trying to hang on to that last tiny little vestige of their empire. And the United States helped them, because Ho Chi Minh was a communist, ergo, we automatically hate him. The Eisenhower administration continued that policy. We funneled billions of dollars into the French war effort. By the time France lost, the U.S. was paying 80% of their cost of the war. We would not yet send troops in, though, and we wouldn't nuke Vietnam, which is what one of Eisenhower's advisors told him to do. There was a peace conference held over the Vietnam situation. It divided the nation of Vietnam into North Vietnam and South Vietnam. That was only supposed to be temporary. The Vietnamese were supposed to hold elections in 1956 to reunify the country. But the leader of South Vietnam, our buddy, Diem was his name, was staunchly anti-communist, and he would not hold that reunification election because he believed that Ho Chi Minh, the communist up in North Korea, would probably win it. The United States continued to pour a lot of money into South Vietnam to prop up the Diem regime, but by the time Eisenhower left office in 1961, Vietnam was being torn apart by full-scale guerrilla revolt. And domestic issues were not going any easier. Now, today, Martin Luther King's birthday is a national holiday, and Selma they just made a movie out of. So it's easy to forget that at the time, the Civil Rights Revolution came as a surprise. Looking back, it seems really obvious to us. The racial system was completely destabilized by World War II. Mass migration out of the South had made black voters a really important part of the Democratic coalition. The Cold War made our racism problems an international embarrassment. But almost nobody predicted a Southern mass movement for civil rights. If people were talking about racial upheaval at all, they expected it to come out of the North, because in the North, African Americans had more opportunity to vote and mobilize and organize. But for Northern blacks, the Cold War had hurt that. Their traditional allies in the Socialist Party and the Communist Party had been completely wiped out or driven underground by McCarthyism. The unions were keeping their heads down. They're not willing to rock the boat when their position is very precarious. So the Northern Civil Rights Movement really didn't have a whole lot of allies, and they themselves were very worried about potentially being painted as un-American, right, as communist sympathizers. The only organization left with the power to launch an assault on segregation and racism was the Southern Black Church. The United States in the 1950s was a rigidly segregated, unequal, completely unequal society. Half of all black families lived in poverty. They had very little job security, had very little access to training for better jobs. Jim Crow was still very firmly in place in the South. Separate schools and separate hospitals and drinking fountains and restaurants and entrances to buildings. In the North, there usually weren't laws that required segregation, but custom did. It's tradition, it's de facto segregation. Barred African Americans from many colleges and hotels and restaurants, and of course from suburban housing. In 1950, there were 17 states, plus Washington, D.C., that had state laws requiring racial segregation of public schools. And a bunch of other states didn't have statewide laws, but left it up to local school districts, who would then often choose to segregate. A solid 40% of the nation's school children studied in legally segregated schools, and most of the rest of them went to schools where housing patterns and school district lines reinforced de facto segregation. And very few white Americans felt any urgency about this problem, or even saw this problem. Now, Truman's Civil Rights Initiative had faded quickly. Congress refused to enact any of it, and outside of, military executive orders, Truman by himself can't do a lot. And then when Eisenhower got into office, he was pretty reluctant to do anything at all unless he was forced to. So the courts had to confront segregation. Now, the NAACP, through the late 40s into the early 50s, had challenged the unequal application of the separate but equal doctrine. You remember, separate but equal comes from the Supreme Court case of Plessy v. Ferguson. It said that it's perfectly okay to have separate facilities for different races as long as those facilities are maintained equally. Well, the NAACP found whole bunches of examples where separate but equal was not being maintained equally, and they went after them. They especially went after higher education, like law schools and med schools, because in many states there was no black equivalent. They started that actually in the 1930s. The University of Missouri. In 1938, the Supreme Court ordered the University of Missouri Law School to admit a black student because Missouri had no black law school. And in response to that, Missouri set up a segregated law school just to satisfy that law. But in 1950, when the University of Texas tried the same trick, the court said it wasn't good enough. They said that the University of Texas Law School had to admit black students, even though technically Texas had created a black law school. Now, the black law school in Texas had 3 classrooms, no bathrooms, and no library. So the court very rightly judged that it was not even remotely equal. Now, the lead attorney for the NAACP was Thurgood Marshall, and he began to plan to launch an assault on segregation itself, not just on the unequal application of separate but equal, but on the foundation of that doctrine itself. But it took a really long time. He wanted to find black families with public school children who were willing to challenge unfair school policies. But doing that took a whole lot of courage. Parents lost their jobs, kids were attacked, homes were burned, businesses were boycotted or destroyed. But finally, in late 1952, the Supreme Court began to hear arguments in these cases. The NAACP had found 5 families in 4 different states that were willing and brave enough to take this all the way to the Supreme Court. And they very specifically wanted families from different states. Like, say they only had a family from Texas. Well, Texas has a very specific kind of segregation law. And if the Supreme Court overturns the Texas law, it doesn't necessarily overturn the Mississippi law or the Virginia law or the Arkansas law. So they wanted to make sure that they had people representing several different segregation systems. So if they're all overturned, then that should wipe out legal segregation in public schools across the nation. They wanted to make sure that they included these different types. Now, when cases are combined like this, the first case alphabetically gives its name to the whole shebang. And in this instance, the first case involved Oliver Brown and his daughter. He had an 8-year-old daughter. She had to walk across dangerous railroad tracks, actually across an entire railroad yard, twice a day to get to and from school, because she was not allowed to go to the neighborhood school because it was white. His lawsuit became Brown v. Board of Education. And it was actually a Board of Education outside the South. It was a Board of Education in a state that didn't have a statewide law requiring segregation. It was the Board of Education of Topeka, Kansas. Kansas left it up to the individual school districts to segregate, and Topeka chose to do so. But Thurgood Marshall decided that it's time to attack the whole separate but equal doctrine. He argued that even with the same funding and facilities, which never happened, segregation is always going to be unequal because it stigmatized one group of citizens as not fit to associate with others. He brought in psychological studies that showed segregation did lifelong damage to black children, undermined their self-esteem. He brought in sociological studies that proved that segregation actually did damage to white children as well. He brought in economic studies, which actually had quite a bit of influence on the decision. The economic studies showed that when you deliberately exclude such a large percentage of the population from education and from job training and from the things that will make them economically productive workers, you hurt your entire country's economy. Now, President Eisenhower, his administration issued a legal brief in this case. Didn't explicitly say you need to undo segregation. What it said was, consider the problem of discrimination in the context of the present struggle between freedom and tyranny. Basically, this shit looks really bad to the outside world, and we're trying to prove that we're better than the Soviets. Now, the Brown decision was unanimous. It said that segregation in public schools violated the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment. They also agreed with Thurgood Marshall that separate is inherently unequal. Now, the black media hailed the Brown decision as a second Emancipation Proclamation. And just like the first Emancipation Proclamation, it was a very limited document. The Brown decision did not address segregation in anything except public schools. And it didn't ban all racial classifications in the laws. Laws against interracial marriage, those are still on the books. Segregation in public transportation, those are still on the books. This decision also didn't address de facto school segregation, which is based on housing patterns and housing law, and not explicit school segregation laws. It also didn't order immediate integration. Instead, the court called for hearings to decide how best to plan to potentially at some point maybe integrate the schools. Brown did mark the emergence of the Supreme Court under Chief Justice Earl Warren, so it's known as the Warren Court, as an active agent of social change. And it inspired a wave of optimism that discrimination could be eliminated. Now, the Brown decision did not cause the modern civil rights movement, but it did help to give a lot of energy to the mass movement that followed. The Brown decision also ensured that if the civil rights movement could bring a challenge before the Supreme Court, the court would probably support them, and mass action began to follow. In December of 1955, Rosa Parks, she's a black seamstress in Montgomery, Alabama, refused to give up her seat on a city bus to a white rider. Parks' arrest for that sparked a bus boycott that lasted for more than a year, and that marked the beginning of the mass phase of the nonviolent civil rights movement. Within the next 10 years, the rights revolution would overturn legal segregation and would regain protection for the right to vote for black Southerners. Now, I don't know what story they told you about Rosa Parks when you were going to school. When I was going to school, they told us she was an elderly seamstress with tired feet. She'd been working hard all day. She just didn't want to give up. She was tired. Rosa Parks herself later said that the only tired she was tired of giving in. Her life makes it clear that the civil rights revolution built on long-term struggle. Rosa Parks wasn't even elderly. She was in her 40s. She was a veteran of black politics. During the 1930s, she had been part of protests. She'd served for many years as the secretary of her local NAACP chapter. In 1943, she tried to register to vote, but she was told that she didn't pass the literacy test, so they wouldn't actually let her see the results of the test. So she came back the next year, and then the year after that, because you can only take it once a year, until finally she passed the test, got her voter card, and then they said, oh, you're going to have to pay a poll tax. And not just the poll tax for that year, which was 45, but for every year since she had turned 21. So to vote in 1945, she had to pay $16.50. But by God, she voted. And she voted in every election from that point until the year that she passed away, which I think was just in like 2005, 2006, very recently. In the early 1950s, Parks had attended training sessions for political activists. She had been a rape investigator. You know, black women could be raped with impunity in many places in the South. Nobody would even bother to investigate, even if the men responsible bragged about doing it. And so Rosa Parks had been involved in several investigations and had been threatened with physical violence if she continued. I don't think that knowing that lessens what she did, though. She knew, probably better than most people, what could have happened to her when she refused to move. Being arrested, probably the best possible outcome. But even knowing that, she did it anyway. And when news of her arrest spread, hundreds of African Americans gathered in a local church and vowed to boycott the Montgomery bus system until they were treated equally. For 381 days, more than a year, despite harassment, despite violence, maids and teachers and janitors and students walked to their destinations or put together a really cool informal taxi carpooling system. Finally, in November of 1956, the Supreme Court ruled that segregation in public transportation is unconstitutional. But the boycott continued for several more weeks because the city of Montgomery still tried to refuse to integrate the buses. Now, the Montgomery bus boycott marked a turning point in post-war American history. It launched a movement for racial justice as a nonviolent crusade based in the black churches of the South. It gained a lot of support from Northern liberals. It focused quite a bit of unwelcome attention on the country's racial policies, and it also marked the emergence of a very young preacher. Martin Luther King was only 26 years old. He came to Montgomery to be a pastor at the local Ebenezer Baptist Church. and he became the national symbol of this movement. Now, from the beginning, the language of freedom was part of this movement. It was, part of the speeches by the civil rights leaders. It was, on the signs carried by the protesters. In 1964, young civil rights activists established freedom schools for black children in the state of Mississippi. And the lessons all began by asking students to define the word freedom. And some of them gave very concrete answers, like going to the public library. Others were more abstract, like standing up for your rights. One of them said that freedom of the mind was the greatest freedom of all. And for adults as well, freedom had a lot of different meanings. It meant having political rights. It meant having economic opportunities. It meant ending segregation and disenfranchisement. It meant having job training. It meant not being threatened with violence. It meant the right to be served at lunch counters and department stores. It meant being addressed with respect as Mr. and Ma'am and not boy. Martin Luther King in particular was a master at tying the language of freedom into the larger movement and making it this cohesive whole. He was also very adept at appealing to the conscience of white Americans. He presented the case for black civil rights in language that merged America's history with the experience of black Americans. His speeches resonated very deeply, both in the African American community and in the broader culture. He repeatedly invoked the Bible to preach justice and forgiveness, and he appealed to white Americans by stressing that the protesters love their country. They are devoted to national values. They just want to make America live up to its promise. Now, buoyed by the success in Montgomery, in 1956, Dr. King created the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. It's basically a coalition of mostly black ministers. But the fact that Montgomery only agreed to desegregate after the Supreme Court told them they had to indicated that without federal backing, local protest might not be enough to work. The white South had fought bitterly and in fact was still fighting against the Brown decision. And that reinforced the idea that African Americans would not gain protection for their rights without intervention from Washington. And that intervention took a long time coming. When the Supreme Court issued their implementation ruling for the Brown decision, they said that desegregation should proceed with all deliberate speed. Now, that's a pretty vague statement, and that vagueness encouraged a campaign of what white Southerners called massive resistance that paralyzed civil rights progress in a lot of the South. In 1956, 82 of the 106 Southern congressmen, including all but 3 Southern senators, signed a document called the Southern Manifesto. The Southern Manifesto denounced the Brown v. Board of Education decision. They called it an abuse of judicial power. They said it should never have been issued. And they called for resistance to forced integration. Some states responded to that by making it illegal for the NAACP to operate within their state. Virginia just closed any public school that was ordered to desegregate. They did offer state money to white students to let them go to private schools, but they didn't give that money to black students. Other states and cities followed their example. Prince Edward County, Virginia, actually took it further. They closed their public school system entirely in 1959. No public schools in the entire county. They did not reopen until the Supreme Court ordered them to in 1964. The private school that the county set up was all white. Prince Edward Academy stayed all white until 1986. Many states adopted what they called freedom of choice plans. It allowed white students basically to opt out of going to public schools if they were afraid that those schools might be integrated. As a symbol of their defiance, and they were very explicit about why they were doing it, the state of Georgia changed their state flag to incorporate the old battle flag of the Army of Northern Virginia, which today is just shorthand called the Confederate flag. Alabama and South Carolina began flying the battle flag over their state capitol buildings. That flag stayed over the South Carolina State House until 2000, and a version of it is still flown over a veterans monument on the grounds of the Capitol building. Georgia's flag remained pro-Confederate until 2001, and the feds mostly tried to stay out of it. There was really one guy in the Senate. The Senate Majority Leader was Lyndon Johnson. He's from Texas. And he hoped to get liberal support for a potential presidential run in 1960. So he strongly encouraged / bullied Congress into passing a civil rights law, the first one since Reconstruction. And in particular, it targeted protection for black voting rights in the South, but it really had no enforcement, so it didn't actually add many voters to the rolls. President Eisenhower didn't provide a whole lot of leadership. He said Americans have to abide by the laws, they have to abide by Supreme Court decisions, but he made it clear that he found the whole issue kind of distasteful. In 1956, a federal court ordered the University of Alabama to integrate. A howling mob prevented, Authoring Lucy was the student in question, prevented her from registering. And then the Board of Trustees expelled her because she hadn't registered for classes. And Eisenhower did jack about that. In 1957, though, he was kind of forced to act. It's an incident in Arkansas. Governor Orville Falbus of Arkansas tried to prevent the court-ordered integration of Little Rock's Central High School, and he called out the Arkansas National Guard to keep these kids, the Little Rock Nine, from being able to attend their classes. Well, you know, the president is the commander-in-chief of the military. The National Guard is one of those bodies that can be federalized. So when a state governor tries to use the National Guard to prevent the implementation of a federal law, it's a problem for the president. Regardless of whether or not Eisenhower thought this was an important issue, pulling the National Guard into it forced his hand. He sent in the 101st Airborne Division to escort these 9 kids into the school. Now, the events in Little Rock showed that the feds wouldn't allow really flagrant violation of court orders. But because of massive resistance, the pace of the movement slowed down quite a bit in the late 1950s. And when Eisenhower left office, fewer than 2% of black students attended desegregated schools in the South. Well, Eisenhower served his 2 terms. He was elected in 52 and again in 56. He's not running again in 1960. His party, the Republicans, chose Vice President Richard Nixon as their candidate. Democrats nominated John F. Kennedy. Kennedy was a senator from Massachusetts. He came from a very wealthy family. His father had been an ambassador to Great Britain. Kennedy's biggest competitors for the Democratic nomination were Hubert Humphrey, who was kind of the party's liberal leader, and then Lyndon Johnson of Texas. He was the Senate Majority Leader. Now, Kennedy had a big problem, though. Kennedy was Catholic. The atmosphere of tolerance promoted by World War II had weakened America's traditional anti-Catholicism, but it hadn't gotten rid of it entirely. In fact, there was a best-selling book in the 1950s called American Freedom and Catholic Power that explicitly accused the Catholic Church of being morally repressive, essentially un-American, and attempting to establish papal tyranny over the United States. A lot of Protestants were very reluctant to vote for a Catholic candidate. They were afraid that Kennedy would have to support church doctrine rather than the Constitution. Some of the more extreme anti-Catholics said that Kennedy would be taking his orders directly from the Pope. And Kennedy had to go down to Houston, Texas, and give a speech before the Baptist Ministerial Alliance in Texas to deal with these issues. He said, "I do not speak for my church on public matters, and the church does not speak for me." At 43 years old, Kennedy became the youngest major party nominee for president. Now, Kennedy and Nixon were actually not terribly far apart in a lot of issues. They were both super big in the Cold War, but Kennedy liked to point out where the Soviets were beating us, like the Sputnik program, where Russia became the first country to send a satellite into orbit. And then they were the first country to successfully test an intercontinental ballistic missile, which meant they could sit in Europe and aim at the United States. Now, Kennedy said that when the Soviets beat us in these things, when they had achievements that we did not, that was proof that the United States had kind of lost its sense of direction, sense of national purpose, because we had let them, or more specifically Eisenhower and Nixon, let them get ahead of us. Kennedy said that Eisenhower and Nixon, and by extension all Republicans, had allowed the Soviets to do better than us. He accused them in particular of allowing a missile gap to form. He said that the Soviets had technological and military superiority over the United States, and Eisenhower had done nothing to stop that. Now, as Kennedy and Nixon both well knew, American military capacity was far beyond anything that the Soviets could muster. There was no missile gap at all. But there was also no factcheck.org. Right? You can't go in there and evaluate a candidate's claims that easily. And his accusations, Kennedy's accusations, persuaded many Americans that the time had come for new leadership. The kind of glamorousness and stylishness of Kennedy and his wife Jackie also kind of pointed this up. Mamie Eisenhower and Pat Nixon, by contrast, looked kind of dowdy. And so that helped to convince many voters that Kennedy would be a much more vibrant, vigorous, youthful president. In the first ever televised presidential debate, the people who watched said that Kennedy had obviously won the debate. Nixon had a cold, he looked tired, he looked really cranky actually. You can watch these on YouTube, and anytime the camera cuts to Nixon while Kennedy is speaking, Nixon looks like he could rip the head off a chicken. He just looks furious. The people who heard the debate on the radio, though, thought that Nixon had won. Nixon sounded like he had a better grasp of the issues. He sounded like he was more informed. The problem for Nixon was, by this point, more people are getting their news from TV than from radio. Image counted for more than sounding like you knew what you were talking about. In November, Kennedy won the election, but not by much. For 69 million votes cast, Kennedy only won by about 120,000. Now, in January of '61, right before he left office, Eisenhower delivered a farewell address on television. Now, Eisenhower knew, just like basically everybody else in government did, that the missile gap accusation was a myth. And he warned the American public against getting caught up in that drumbeat of fear and military buildup. He warned Americans about what he called the military-industrial complex. Basically what Ike was saying was, we're going to get into a situation where the companies that supply the military, that supply the weapons and the transportation and make a profit from war, will start to exert more influence on the government to get into a war. Congressmen will take campaign donations from them, then they will declare war, They will make sure that their campaign donors get defense contracts so they can make money off of this war. And then the industry will pour more money into the campaigns of those congressmen who gave them the defense contracts. Now, in 1961, hardly anybody thought that Eisenhower knew what he was talking about, which really, he's General freaking Eisenhower. If he says, hey, you might want to worry about too much military buildup, he's probably somebody you should listen to. But nobody shared his concern. A few years later, though, with the United States locked in an increasingly unpopular war, Eisenhower's warning is going to seem a little more prophetic. But by the time Eisenhower left office, though, most of the underpinnings of 1950s life were in disarray. The tens of millions of cars that made suburban life possible, they were spewing toxic lead into the atmosphere. Lead used to be not just a common gasoline additive, it was added to all gasolines. You know what lead poisoning does to the human body? It causes kidney failure, it causes heart failure, and miscarriages, and brain damage. Leaded fuel wasn't banned until 1996. Los Angeles became synonymous with smog, air pollution produced by cars. There is this steady haze of leaded fog over the city all the time. Chlorofluorocarbons, which were used in air conditioners and deodorants and aerosol hairsprays, were releasing chemicals into the air that damaged the ozone layer and led to an increase in skin cancer. The chemical insecticides that made it possible to have all of these wonderful fruits and vegetables were poisoning farm workers and consumers and the water supply. Housewives were rebelling against their life being forced into these suburban dream houses, and African Americans were increasingly impatient with the slow pace of change. And so the United States enters the very turbulent 1960s. But that is a subject for the next lecture.